10 women, 9 choices, one moment that changes everything. They lined them up like cattle in the town square, mail-order brides fresh off the stagecoach, dusty and desperate. One by one, the men stepped forward, claiming the prettiest, the youngest, the thinnest, until only she remained. Maeve O'Connor, the one nobody wanted. The laughter started soft, then grew cruel. She stood there, humiliated, ready to disappear. Then hoofbeats shattered the mockery. A mountain of a man rode in, feared, whispered about, avoided. And he chose her. What happens next will leave you breathless. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The September sun beat down on Thornfield's town square like a hammer on an anvil, merciless and unforgiving. Dust hung in the air, thick enough to taste, coating everything in a fine layer of grit that settled into the creases of worn dresses and the corners of tired eyes. Maeve O'Connor stood in that dust, fourth from the left in a line of 10 women, and tried to make herself smaller. It was impossible, of course. At nearly 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and a body that had never known hunger long enough to waste away, Maeve took up space whether she wanted to or not. Her hands, calloused and strong from years of work, clutched at the fabric of her gray traveling dress, the nicest thing she owned, though it had seen better days. The seams strained across her hips. The collar sat too tight against her throat. She'd let it out twice already, and still it fought her. "Lord above, they're inspecting us like horses," whispered the woman to her right, a petite blonde named Catherine, who'd spent the entire 3-week journey from Boston primping and preening. "I can't believe this is actually happening." Maeve said nothing. She'd learned long ago that silence served her better than words. Words invited attention, and attention invited cruelty. The 10 of them had arrived an hour ago, stepping down from the stagecoach into a town that looked like it had been carved from the very mountains surrounding it, rough, unfinished, and barely civilized. Thornfield existed because of silver, the kind of strike that brought desperate men west with dreams of fortune. Those same men now stood in a semicircle around the women, studying them with the focused intensity of buyers at an auction. "Welcome, ladies, to Thornfield," Mayor Garrett had announced when they first arrived, his voice booming with false cheer. He was a round man with a red face and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "I'm sure you're all tired from your journey, but these fine gentlemen have been waiting mighty patiently for your arrival. Why don't we let them take a look at what they're getting?" What they're getting, not who. Maeve had noticed the distinction immediately. The arrangement had been simple enough, at least on paper. Thornfield needed women, the kind of civilized, marriageable women who could bring some semblance of society to a mining town populated almost entirely by men. The widows and spinsters and desperate women of the East needed husbands, homes, and a fresh start. A matchmaking service had made the introductions through carefully worded letters and sanitized descriptions. Money had changed hands, promises had been made, but nobody had mentioned the inspection. "Gentlemen, please, one at a time," Mayor Garrett called out as the men began to press closer. "Let's keep this orderly. Each of you has already indicated your preferences based on the descriptions provided. We'll start with Mr. Patterson, seeing as how he was first to put down his deposit." A lanky man with a patchy beard stepped forward, clutching his hat in both hands. His eyes skimmed over the line of women before settling on Catherine. "That one," he said, pointing. "The blonde." Catherine's face went through several expressions in quick succession: relief, triumph, nervousness, before settling on a practiced smile. She stepped forward, taking Patterson's offered arm, and just like that, there were 9. "Mr. Donnelly, you're next." The process continued with brutal efficiency. A dark-haired beauty named Sarah was claimed by a shopkeeper. A nervous girl barely out of her teens went to a farmer who looked old enough to be her grandfather. One by one, the women stepped out of the line, chosen for their small waists, their pretty faces, their youth, their delicate hands that had never seen hard labor. Maeve remained standing. She kept her eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the crowd, refusing to watch as the men looked her over and found her wanting. She knew what they saw. She'd seen it reflected in mirrors and windows and the pitying eyes of strangers her entire life. Too tall, too broad, too heavy, too much. By the time 7 women had been chosen, The mood in the square had shifted. The initial formality had given way to something uglier. Men who'd been passed over were growing restless, their disappointment turning to resentment. And the remaining women, Maeve and two others, were starting to understand what it meant to be unwanted. "Well now," Mayor Garrett said, his cheerfulness wearing thin. "We still have 3 lovely ladies and 3 outstanding bachelors. Mr. Cooper, would you like to—" "Not that one," Cooper interrupted, jutting his chin toward Maeve. "The redhead or the brunette, but not the big one." Heat flooded Maeve's face. Around the square she heard laughter, low and mean, the kind that burrowed under skin and stayed there. "Now, Mr. Cooper," the mayor began, but Cooper was already stepping toward the redhead, a sharp-featured woman named Margaret who looked like she might cry. The brunette, a widow named Mrs. Fletcher, was chosen next by a mill worker who seemed more interested in getting the process over with than in the woman herself. And then there was one. Maeve stood alone in the center of the square, the gap where the other women had been yawning open around her like a wound. The remaining bachelor, a greasy man named Tucker, who smelled of whiskey and bad intentions, stared at her with unconcealed disgust. "You cannot be serious," Tucker said, addressing the mayor rather than Maeve. "I paid good money for this arrangement, same as everybody else. I was promised a wife, not that." The laughter was louder now, rolling through the crowd in waves. Maeve felt each guffaw like a physical blow. Her hands shook, her vision blurred. She wanted to run, to disappear, to be anywhere but here, but her legs wouldn't move. She was trapped, pinned in place by shame and the weight of all those staring eyes. "Mr. Tucker, please," Mayor Garrett said, though he didn't sound particularly concerned. "Miss O'Connor came all this way, same as the others. Surely we can—" "I'll take my money back," Tucker declared. "I ain't taking that one. Look at her. She's bigger than me. What kind of wife is that supposed to be?" "A strong one," someone muttered, setting off another round of laughter. Maeve's throat tightened. She couldn't breathe. The collar of her dress felt like a noose. Around her the crowd pressed closer, their laughter and jeers blending into a roar that filled her ears and drowned out everything else. "She'd probably eat a man out of house and home. Wonder if the stagecoach charged extra freight for hauling her. Maybe we could use her at the mine, look strong enough to swing a pickaxe." The words pelted her like stones. Maeve closed her eyes, willing herself to disappear, to wake up, to be anywhere but here. This was worse than Boston, worse than the orphanage, worse than anything she'd endured, because at least before she'd had the dignity of privacy. Here, her humiliation was public entertainment. "Please," she whispered, though she didn't know who she was begging or what she was asking for. "Please." Mayor Garrett cleared his throat. "Well, this is certainly awkward. Mr. Tucker, I understand your disappointment, but—" "My disappointment?" Tucker's voice rose to a shout. "I've been saving for months, and you're trying to pawn off this. I want my money back, Garrett, every cent. Now let's not be hasty. Perhaps if we—" The sound cut through everything else. Not loud, but sharp, distinct. The kind of sound that made every head turn and every voice fall silent. Hoofbeats. A single horse, moving at a walk, entering the square from the eastern road. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a path before the rider had even come into full view. Maeve opened her eyes. The man on the horse was massive. Not just tall, though he was that, easily 6.5 feet, but built like something carved from the mountains themselves. Broad shoulders stretched the fabric of a dark coat that had seen years of hard use. His hands, resting loose on the reins, were scarred and enormous. He wore his dark hair long, pulled back from a face that looked like it had been weathered by wind and violence in equal measure. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, doing nothing to soften the hard angles of his jaw. But it was his eyes that held Maeve frozen. Dark as creek stones, flat and unreadable, they swept across the crowd with the kind of indifference usually reserved for cattle or dirt. He looked at the people of Thornfield like they were nothing, less than nothing. And the town, for all its earlier bravado, went absolutely silent. "Crow," someone whispered, and the name spread through the crowd like wildfire. Elias Crow. Even Maeve, fresh off the stagecoach and new to this territory, had heard the name. The Mountain Man. The recluse who lived somewhere up in the high peaks, emerging maybe twice a year to trade furs and replenish supplies. Stories about him varied wildly. Some said he'd killed a dozen men, others that he'd been raised by wolves, still others that he'd made some dark bargain with whatever spirits haunted the deep woods. What everyone agreed on was this: Elias Crow was not someone you approached, not someone you bothered, not someone you wanted anything to do with. He rode into the center of the square, his horse, a huge gray mare that looked half wild herself, stepping carefully through the crowd. When he reached the space where Maeve stood alone, he stopped. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Not the way Tucker had looked, with disgust. Not the way the crowd looked, with mockery. He looked at her the way a man might study a mountain or a river, assessing, calculating, reading something the rest of them couldn't see. Maeve stared back, too shocked to look away. Up close, his size was even more intimidating. He could break her in half without effort, could do anything he wanted, and no one here would stop him. But there was something in his eyes, not kindness exactly, but not cruelty either, just consideration. "You," he said. His voice was deep, rough from disuse, like gravel shifting. "You're unclaimed." It wasn't a question, but Maeve nodded anyway, her throat too tight for words. Elias Crow looked at Mayor Garrett. "What's the price?" The mayor blinked, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. What?" "The price," Crow repeated, his voice flat, "for a bride." "What did these others pay?" $50, but Mr. Crow, I don't think—" Crow reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch that clinked heavily when he tossed it to the mayor. It landed in Garrett's hands with enough weight to make him stumble. "That's $100, for the inconvenience." The square had gone so quiet, Maeve could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. "Mr. Crow," the mayor stammered, "surely you don't mean to— That is, there must be some mistake." "No mistake." Crow turned his attention back to Maeve. "You got belongings?" She nodded mutely, gesturing toward the single worn trunk that sat beside the stagecoach. "Get them." It wasn't a request, but it wasn't cruel either. Just direct. Simple. Maeve's legs moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her toward the trunk on muscle memory alone. Behind her, she heard Mayor Garrett trying to speak, but Crow cut him off. "She's mine. That's the end of it." "But, Mr. Crow, perhaps you'd like to reconsider. There will be other—" "I don't reconsider." Something in Crow's voice made the mayor stop talking immediately. "She's coming with me. Anyone got a problem with that?" The silence stretched. No one moved. No one spoke. Even Tucker, who'd been so loud moments before, seemed to have swallowed his tongue. Maeve reached her trunk and stood there, her hands shaking so badly she couldn't grip the handles. This couldn't be happening. This man, this terrifying, enormous man, couldn't actually be claiming her. This had to be some new form of mockery, some elaborate joke designed to humiliate her even further. But then he was there beside her, moving with surprising quiet for someone so large. He didn't speak, just bent and lifted her trunk with one hand like it weighed nothing at all. With his other hand, he offered her the reins of his horse. "You can ride?" Maeve shook her head. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "You'll learn. Come on." He walked toward the edge of the square. Her trunk balanced effortlessly on his shoulder, his horse following docilely behind. Maeve stood frozen for another heartbeat, her mind screaming at her to run, to refuse, to do anything but follow this stranger into the mountains. But then she looked back at the crowd, at Tucker's disgusted face, at the mayor's relief that his problem was solving itself, at all those people who'd laughed at her, mocked her, made her feel like something less than human, and she followed Elias Crow. The crowd parted for them like water around a stone. Whispers started up in their wake, but quietly, careful not to be overheard. Maeve kept her eyes straight ahead, refusing to look at any of them. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her hands still shook. But she walked. At the edge of town, Crow stopped and secured her trunk to his horse's saddle with practiced efficiency. Then he turned to her, holding out one massive hand. "Up you go." Maeve stared at the hand, then at the horse, then back at him. I've never— First time for everything." He waited, patient as stone, his hand still extended. Taking a breath that felt like swallowing glass, Maeve placed her hand in his. His grip was firm but not crushing, his palm rough with calluses. He lifted her onto the horse's back with the same ease he'd lifted her trunk, then swung up behind her before she could process what was happening. She stiffened immediately. He was too close, too large. His chest pressed against her back, his arms coming around her to grip the reins. She could feel the heat of him through layers of fabric, could smell leather and pine and wood smoke. "Easy," he said, and for a moment she thought he was talking to her, but no, he was speaking to the horse. "We've got a long ride ahead." The horse started forward at a walk, carrying them away from Thornfield, away from the square, away from the laughter and mockery and humiliation. Maeve sat rigid as a board, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to do anything that might remind him she was there. They rode in silence as the town fell away behind them, the buildings giving way to scrub brush and scattered pines. The road, such as it was, began to climb, winding up into the foothills of the massive mountains that loomed in the distance. "You got a name?" Crow asked after what felt like an eternity. "Maeve," she whispered. "Maeve O'Connor." Maeve. He said it carefully, like he was testing the weight of it. "Irish?" "My parents were. I was born in Boston." "Long way from home." She almost laughed. Home. As if Boston had ever been home. The orphanage where she'd grown up, passed over by every family looking to adopt because she was too big, too awkward, too much. The factory where she'd worked 16-hour days for pennies, her size making her useful for the heavy lifting the smaller girls couldn't manage. The boarding house where the other women had whispered about her, pitied her, avoided her. "I don't have a home," she said quietly. Crow made a sound that might have been acknowledgement. They rode on, the horse's steady gait eating up the miles. The sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. "Why?" Maeve asked finally, the word bursting out before she could stop it. "Why did you... Why me?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. The only sounds were the horse's hooves on the rocky path, the creak of leather, the whisper of wind through the pines. "Because you were the only one they left standing alone," he said at last, "and because you didn't cry." Maeve blinked. "What?" "The others, the ones who got chosen, some of them cried. Some of them looked scared. Some of them looked like they were going to bolt." He shifted slightly behind her, his voice steady and matter-of-fact. "But you just stood there. Took it. Didn't break." "That's not strength," Maeve said bitterly. "That's just, I didn't have anywhere to run to." "Maybe. Or maybe you're stronger than you think." She didn't know what to say to that. No one had ever called her strong before. Big, yes. Heavy, certainly. But strong. That was something else entirely. "Where are we going?" she asked instead. "My cabin. Up in the high country. It's about a 3-hour ride from here." 3 hours. 3 hours deeper into the wilderness with this stranger. 3 hours farther from anything resembling civilization. Maeve's stomach twisted with fear and something else. Something that felt dangerously close to hope. "And when we get there," she pressed, "what happens then?" Crow was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "That depends on you." "On me?" "I need a wife. Someone who can handle mountain living. Someone strong enough to survive winters that'll kill the unprepared. Someone who won't break the first time things get hard." He paused. "You fit the bill." "You don't know anything about me." "I know you traveled 3 weeks to get here. I know you stood in that square and took every cruel word they threw at you without flinching. I know you're still sitting on this horse instead of screaming or trying to jump off." His voice dropped slightly. "That's enough to start with." Maeve's mind reeled. "You need a worker, not a wife." "Maybe I need both. Winter up here isn't forgiving. I need someone who can pull their weight, but I also need..." He trailed off, seeming to search for words. "Company. Someone to talk to, someone to build something with. And if I can't, if I'm not what you need, then we figure it out when we get there. But I'm not going to hurt you if that's what you're worried about. I'm not that kind of man." Maeve wanted to believe him. Desperately, she wanted to believe him. But she'd learned long ago that men's words were cheap, their promises even cheaper. As if reading her thoughts, Crow added, "You'll have your own space in the cabin, your own room. I'm not expecting anything from you that you're not willing to give. We'll start as strangers and see where it goes from there." The path grew steeper, the horses' breathing becoming more labored as they climbed. The air grew cooler, thinner, carrying the sharp scent of pine and snow from the peaks above. Below them, Thornfield had disappeared from view entirely, swallowed by distance and darkening sky. "I don't understand," Maeve said softly. "Those other women, they were prettier, smaller, more what?" Crow's voice held no mockery. "More delicate, more likely to die the first winter, more likely to complain about every hardship, more likely to look at my cabin and cry because it's not fancy enough, more marriageable." By whose measure? He shifted the reins slightly, guiding the horse around a fallen log. "Up here, pretty doesn't matter. Delicate doesn't matter. What matters is, can you chop wood when I'm out hunting? Can you tend a garden in rocky soil? Can you shoot a rifle if wolves come calling? Can you stitch up a wound without fainting? Can you be alone for days at a time without losing your mind?" Maeve thought about the factory, the heavy lifting, the long hours, about the orphanage, where she'd been expected to do the work of 2 girls because of her size, about all the ways she'd learned to be useful, to be strong, to survive. "Yes," she said quietly, "I can do all of that." "Then you're exactly what I need." The simplicity of it struck her silent. No qualifications, no buts, just acceptance of what she could do, not shame for what she wasn't. They rode on as darkness fell in earnest, the path lit only by moonlight filtering through the pine canopy. Maeve's body ached from the unfamiliar position, her muscles protesting the constant adjustment to the horse's movement. But she didn't complain, she'd endured worse. "Almost there," Crow said eventually. And then, through a break in the trees, she saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed up against a cliff face that rose vertically into the night sky. It was larger than she'd expected, solidly built from thick logs, with a stone chimney and a covered porch. Outbuildings clustered nearby. A barn, a smokehouse, what looked like a root cellar. Behind the cabin, Maeve could hear the sound of running water. A creek, maybe, or a small waterfall. Crow dismounted first, then lifted Maeve down with the same easy strength he'd shown before. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit the ground, stiff from the long ride. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, waiting until she nodded before letting go. "Wait here," he said, and disappeared into the cabin. Moments later, warm light spilled from the windows as he lit lamps inside. He emerged carrying a lantern, which he hung on a hook by the door before returning to the horse. Maeve stood awkwardly, unsure what to do with herself. She watched as Crow unsaddled the horse with efficient movements, speaking quietly to the animal as he worked. The horse, clearly his partner rather than just his transportation, nuzzled his shoulder affectionately. "Her name's Storm," Crow said without looking at Maeve. "She's friendly once she knows you." He led Storm to the barn, leaving Maeve alone in the clearing. The night air was cold enough to make her breath visible, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering. Above, more stars than she'd ever seen filled the sky, so many, and so bright it almost hurt to look at them. When Crow returned, he picked up her trunk again and gestured toward the cabin. "Come on, you must be frozen." The cabin's interior was warm, heated by a fire already burning in the large stone fireplace. Maeve's first impression was of space. The main room was far larger than she'd expected, with a kitchen area on one side, a sitting area near the fire, and a heavy wooden table in between. The furnishings were simple but well made. Chairs that looked like they could support any weight, a sturdy table, shelves lined with books and supplies. Everything was clean, organized, purposeful. "That's your room," Crow said, pointing to a door on the far wall. "Mine's upstairs in the loft. There's a washroom out back. It's got a pump and a tub. Water's cold, but I can heat some if you want a bath." He set her trunk down by the door he'd indicated, then moved to the kitchen. Maeve stood frozen in the middle of the room, overwhelmed by everything, the warmth, the size, the simple fact that she was here, in this place, with this man. "You hungry?" Crow asked, rummaging through a cupboard. Maeve's stomach answered for her, growling loudly enough to echo in the quiet cabin. Heat flooded her face, but Crow just nodded as if that was answer enough. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the table. "I'll make something." She sat, watching as he moved around the kitchen with the same efficiency he'd shown with everything else. Within minutes, he'd started coffee brewing and was cutting thick slices from a loaf of dark bread. He added cheese, dried meat, and some kind of preserve, assembling simple but substantial sandwiches. When he set a plate in front of her, Maeve stared at it. The portion was generous, more food than she'd typically allow herself. "It's not much," Crow said, sitting across from her with his own plate. "But it'll hold you until morning. Tomorrow I'll make a proper breakfast." Maeve picked up the sandwich with trembling hands. She took a bite and nearly groaned. The bread was hearty, the cheese sharp, the meat flavorful. After weeks of travel rations, it tasted like a feast. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the distant murmur of running water. Crow ate quickly but not messily, finishing his food in a few large bites. He watched her across the table, not staring but not looking away either. "Thank you," Maeve said quietly when she'd finished. "For the food, and for earlier." Crow nodded. "You should rest. It's been a long day." "Mr. Crow, Just Crow," he interrupted. "Or Elias, if you prefer. But not Mr." "Elias?" She tested the name. It felt strange on her tongue, too familiar for someone she'd known only hours. "I need to know what you expect from me. What this arrangement means." He leaned back in his chair, studying her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "I expect honesty. I expect effort. I expect you to tell me if something's wrong instead of suffering in silence." He paused. "As for what this means, we're married in the eyes of the town, whether we had a ceremony or not. But what we are to each other, that's something we'll have to figure out as we go. And if we can't, if this doesn't work, then come spring, when the pass is clear, I'll take you back to Thornfield, or to any other town you want to go to, with enough money to start over." His expression was serious. "I'm not keeping you prisoner, Maeve. You're free to leave anytime you choose. But if you're going to be here, I need to know you're here because you want to be, not because you're scared to go." Well, Maeve nodded slowly, trying to process everything. "Why are you being kind to me?" The question seemed to surprise him. His brows drew together, creating deep lines in his forehead. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Because no one else ever has been." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest. Crow's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. "Then they were fools," he said simply. "Get some rest, Maeve. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. I'll need to show you around, teach you where things are. Can't have you getting lost or hurt because I didn't explain properly." He stood, gathering their plates. Maeve rose as well, suddenly exhausted beyond measure. Her body ached, her mind reeled, and her emotions felt like they'd been put through a wringer. "Good night," she managed. "Good night." Maeve retreated to her room, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The space was small but cozy. A narrow bed with thick blankets, a chest of drawers, a small window that looked out into the darkness. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed, waiting to be unpacked. But unpacking would mean accepting this as real. Would mean admitting that her life had just taken a turn so strange and unexpected that she couldn't begin to process it. Instead, she sat on the bed, which held her weight without protest, and stared at her hands in the lamplight. These hands that had been mocked for their size, criticized for their roughness, deemed unsuitable for polite society. These hands that Elias Crow seemed to think were exactly what he needed. Through the door, she could hear him moving around the main room, banking the fire, checking the windows, completing the small rituals of settling in for the night. Normal sounds, domestic sounds, the sounds of a life being lived. Tomorrow would bring questions. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Tomorrow would force her to confront what she'd gotten herself into. But tonight, for the first time in longer than she could remember, Maeve felt something that wasn't shame or fear or resignation. She felt possibility. And as she finally lay down in that narrow bed, in that cabin in the mountains, with a stranger moving quietly overhead, Maeve allowed herself something she'd rarely permitted: hope. The humiliation in Thornfield Square had been real. The laughter had cut deep. The rejection had stung like it always did. But maybe, just maybe, that hadn't been an ending after all. Maybe it had been a beginning. Maeve woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood. The rhythmic crack echoed through the morning air, sharp and clean, pulling her from dreams she couldn't quite remember. For a moment she lay disoriented in the unfamiliar bed, staring at rough-hewn ceiling beams she didn't recognize. Then it all came rushing back: the square, the laughter, the mountain man, the ride through darkness to this cabin perched at the edge of the world. She sat up slowly, her body protesting. Every muscle ached from yesterday's long ride, stiff and sore, in ways she hadn't anticipated. Pale morning light filtered through the small window, painting everything in shades of gray and gold. The axe fell again outside. Crack. A pause. Crack. Maeve stood, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor, and moved to the window. From this angle she could see Elias in the clearing behind the cabin, his back to her as he worked. He'd removed his coat despite the morning chill, and she could see the play of muscles beneath his shirt as he raised the axe and brought it down with precision that came from years of practice. Each log split clean, falling in two perfect halves. He made it look effortless. She turned away from the window, suddenly aware that she was still wearing yesterday's travel-stained dress. Her trunk sat where she'd left it, and she knelt to open it, taking inventory of her meager possessions. 3 dresses, all practical and worn, a nightgown, 2 sets of undergarments, a shawl, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, a small Bible that had been given to her at the orphanage, though she rarely opened it. And at the very bottom, wrapped in cloth, the only thing of value she owned, her mother's locket, tarnished silver with a broken clasp. Not much to show for 26 years of life. Maeve changed quickly into her least worn dress, a faded blue that had once been pretty before countless washings had dulled the color. She braided her dark hair with practiced efficiency, pinning it into a coil at the nape of her neck. No mirror hung in the room, but she didn't need one. She knew what she looked like. When she emerged from her room, the main cabin was empty. The fire had been stoked, and coffee sat warming on the stove, filling the air with its rich aroma. A covered plate waited on the table: bread, butter, and what looked like fried eggs. Still warm. He'd made her breakfast and left it for her. The simple kindness of it made her throat tight. Maeve ate standing up, too nervous to sit, too hungry to wait. The eggs were perfect, the bread fresh. She was washing her plate in the basin when the door opened and Elias entered, carrying an armload of split wood. "You're up," he observed, moving to stack the wood beside the fireplace. "Wasn't sure if you'd sleep longer after yesterday." "I'm an early riser," Maeve said. "The factory started at dawn. I'm used to it." He nodded, brushing bark and sawdust from his hands. "Good. There's a lot to show you today. Best to start while the light's good." "Show me?" "The property, the animals, where everything is and how it works. Can't have you stumbling around blind if something happens to me." The casual way he said it, "if something happens to me," sent a chill down Maeve's spine. "What could happen?" Elias shrugged, pouring himself coffee. "Hunting accidents, falls, bad weather, mountain lion, bears when they're hungry enough. Living out here means being prepared for anything." He took a long drink, watching her over the rim of his cup. "I'm not trying to scare you, just being honest about what life looks like up here." Maeve absorbed this, filing it away with all the other pieces of information she was gathering about this strange new world. "What do you need me to do?" "First, get you some proper boots. Those things won't last a week." He gestured at her worn leather shoes suitable for city streets, but already showing strain from yesterday's journey. "I've got spares in the barn. They'll be too big, but we can stuff them with wool until we can get you fitted properly." "When would that be?" "Next time I go to Thornfield. Maybe a month, maybe 2. Depends on the weather and what supplies we need." He set down his coffee. "Come on, daylight's wasting." The morning air bit at Maeve's face when they stepped outside, cold enough to make her breath visible. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, following Elias across the clearing toward the barn. Up close, the outbuildings were even more impressive than they'd seemed in last night's darkness, all solidly built, well-maintained, designed to withstand the harsh mountain weather. "Built most of this myself," Elias said, pulling open the barn door. "Took 3 years to get it all the way I wanted it." Inside, the barn smelled of hay and animals and leather. Storm occupied one of 2 stalls, her gray coat gleaming in the light that filtered through gaps in the walls. She whickered softly when she saw Elias, pushing her nose against his chest. "Morning, girl." He stroked her neck with genuine affection. "Maeve, come here. Let her get your scent." Maeve approached cautiously. She'd never been around horses much. They were expensive, beyond the reach of orphans and factory workers. Storm was enormous up close, her shoulder easily level with Maeve's head. "Hand out flat," Elias instructed. "Let her sniff you." Maeve extended her hand, trying not to flinch when Storm's soft muzzle brushed her palm. The horse exhaled heavily, studying her with large, intelligent eyes, then apparently decided she was acceptable. Storm bumped her head against Maeve's shoulder, nearly knocking her over. "She likes you," Elias said, something that might have been approval in his voice. "That's good. You'll be working with her a lot." "Working with her how?" "Riding, hauling. She'll pull a plow come spring if we need her to." He moved to a chest in the corner, rummaging through its contents. "Here, try these." He tossed her a pair of boots that were indeed far too large. Maeve sat on a hay bale and pulled them on, stuffing the toes with handfuls of wool Elias provided until they fit well enough to walk in. They were heavy, stiff, nothing like her delicate city shoes. But when she stood and took a few experimental steps, she could feel the difference immediately. Solid, sturdy, made for rough terrain. "Better," Elias said. "You'll get blisters at first, but that's unavoidable. We'll toughen your feet up." He led her out of the barn and across to the other outbuildings. The smokehouse held hanging meat, venison, he explained, from a hunt 2 weeks ago. The root cellar was dug deep into the hillside, staying cool even in summer, and currently held potatoes, carrots, onions, and jars of preserved vegetables and fruits. "This is what keeps us alive through winter," Elias said, gesturing at the neat rows of supplies. "We eat fresh when we can, but from November to April, this is it. So we preserve everything we can't eat immediately." "You did all this yourself?" "Wasn't going to starve because I was too lazy to put food by." He closed the cellar door. "This way." Behind the cabin, the sound of running water grew louder. Elias led her through a stand of pines to where a creek tumbled down from higher elevations, clear and cold and quick-moving. A wooden sluice had been built to divert some of the water toward a small enclosed structure. "Wash house," Elias explained. "The pump in the cabin pulls from here too. Water's always cold, but it's clean. I usually heat it in the cabin for washing." He paused. "There's a deeper pool upstream, about a 10-minute walk. I bathe there in summer. Too cold now, but come June, it's nice." Maeve tried to imagine bathing outdoors, tried to picture this massive, fierce man relaxing in a mountain pool. The image was so at odds with everything she knew about civilized life that she almost laughed. "What?" Elias asked, catching her expression. "Nothing. It's just different from what I'm used to." "Different good or different bad?" She considered. "Different honest. Everything here has a purpose. Nothing's just for show." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "Come on, still more to see." They spent the morning walking the property, Elias pointing out landmarks and explaining systems. He showed her the garden plot, empty now but clearly well-tended during growing season. The chicken coop, currently chickenless but ready for spring. The woodshed, stacked full with split logs. The shooting range he'd set up in a natural depression, where he practiced and taught himself to be accurate enough to hunt effectively. "You'll need to learn to shoot," he said. "Not suggesting, requiring. You need to be able to defend yourself if I'm not here." "I've never held a gun." "Then we start from the beginning." He looked at her seriously. "This isn't town, Maeve. There's no law up here except what we make. No help except what we can provide ourselves. You understand that?" She nodded slowly. "Yes." "Good." He checked the sun's position. "We should head back. You need to learn the kitchen next." The kitchen, as it turned out, was Elias's domain in ways she hadn't expected. He moved through it with the same efficiency he brought to everything else, showing her where supplies were kept, how the stove worked, what needed to be rationed, and what could be used freely. "I cook most of the time," he said, pulling out various containers. "But you should know how everything works in case you need to. Plus, if you've got specialties, I'd be happy to eat something besides my own cooking for a change." "I'm not much of a cook," Maeve admitted. "At the factory, we ate whatever the boarding house served. Before that, At the orphanage, I was usually assigned to laundry or heavy work. Because of your size. It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. Yes. Elias was quiet for a moment, measuring flour into a bowl. People are stupid, he said finally. They see something different and immediately assume it's wrong. Doesn't matter if it's actually better suited for the work, or stronger, or more capable. Just matters that it doesn't fit their narrow idea of what things should look like. Maeve stared at him. You're talking about me. I'm talking about anyone who's been judged for something they can't control. He added water to the flour, kneading it into dough with steady pressure. I grew up in a town, regular place, regular people, but I was always too big, too quiet, too strange, didn't fit. So they made me into a monster in their minds. Easier than trying to understand me. Is that why you left? Part of it. He shaped the dough into a loaf, setting it aside to rise. Other part was I got tired of pretending to be something I wasn't. Up here, I can just be myself. Don't have to perform for anybody. Maeve understood that more than she wanted to admit. What happened to your family? Dead. Fever took my parents when I was 17. No siblings, no wife. He met her eyes. That's why I need one now, not for company, though that's part of it, but because this place is too much for one person alone. I need a partner. And you think I can be that? I think you can be exactly that. If you want to be. He wiped his hands on a cloth. Question is, do you want to be? Before Maeve could answer, a sound cut through the quiet, sharp and high and wrong. Elias's head snapped up, his entire body going tense. Stay here, he ordered, already moving toward the door. What is it? Trouble. He grabbed a rifle from above the door and was outside before she could ask anything else. Maeve stood frozen for a heartbeat, then followed, her new boots loud on the wooden porch. In the clearing, 3 men sat on horses, their weapons visible and their intentions clear in the way they'd positioned themselves between the cabin and the barn. They were rough-looking, the kind of men who made their living through intimidation and violence. The center rider, a scarred man with cold eyes, leaned forward in his saddle. Heard you got yourself a woman, Crow, the man called out. Thought we'd come to see if the rumors were true. Elias stood utterly still, his rifle held low but ready. Vance, you're on my property. Public land, far as I can tell. My property, Elias repeated, his voice flat and dangerous. Turn around. The man called Vance smiled, showing broken teeth. Now that's not very hospitable. We rode all this way. Least you could do is introduce us to your new bride. Maeve's blood went cold. She wanted to retreat into the cabin, to hide, but some instinct told her that showing fear would be the worst thing she could do. So she stepped forward instead, moving to stand beside Elias despite the warning in his eyes. Vance's gaze slid to her, and she saw the calculation there, assessing her worth, her weakness, what she could be used for. Well now, this is the one they were laughing about in Thornfield, ain't it? The big one nobody wanted. Get off my land. Each word from Elias was measured, deadly calm. We're just being friendly, Crow. No need to get... The shot split the air, so close to Vance's horse that the animal reared, nearly throwing its rider. Elias had fired without seeming to aim, the rifle already trained back on the center rider before Maeve's ears stopped ringing. Next one goes through your skull, Elias said. Your choice. Vance fought to control his panicking horse, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. You'll regret this, Crow. You can't protect her all the time. Try me. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other, the threat hanging heavy in the air. Then Vance yanked his horse around, gesturing sharply to his companions. They rode back the way they'd come, their departure marked by angry curses and the clatter of hooves on stone. Elias didn't lower the rifle until they disappeared into the tree line. Even then, he stood watching, his body still tense as a drawn bow. Who were they? Maeve asked quietly. Vultures. He finally turned to look at her, and something in his expression made her step back. What did I tell you about staying inside? You said stay here. I was here. I meant... He stopped, took a breath, visibly forcing himself to calm. Those men are dangerous, Maeve. They're part of a gang that operates in these mountains. They rob, they kill, they take what they want. If they'd grabbed you, they didn't. But they could have. And then what? His voice rose slightly. You think I could fight off 3 armed men? You think... I think I'm tired of hiding, Maeve said, surprising herself with the force of her words. I've spent my whole life making myself smaller, quieter, less visible, hoping that if I just stayed out of the way, people would leave me alone. It never worked, so I'm done hiding. Elias stared at her. That's brave and stupid in equal measure. Maybe, but it's my choice to make. Something passed between them then, understanding maybe, or recognition. Elias looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing her, beyond the size or the face or the circumstances that had brought her here. All right, he said finally, your choice. But that means you learn to shoot. Today. Because if Vance and his friends come back, I need to know you can defend yourself. I said I would. No. You agreed in theory. Now I'm telling you it's necessary. He gestured toward the depression that served as his shooting range. Come on. The rifle was heavier than Maeve expected, the weight of it unfamiliar in her hands. Elias showed her how to hold it, how to sight along the barrel, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull the trigger. Your size is an advantage here, he said, adjusting her stance. More stability. Less kickback will throw you off. The gun doesn't care if you're pretty. It only cares if you can use it properly. The first shot went wide, the recoil surprising despite his warnings. The second was closer. By the 10th, she was starting to understand the rhythm of it, the patience required, the steadiness, the way her body could work with the weapon rather than against it. Good, Elias said as she hit the target he'd set up, a mark on a dead tree 30 yards away. Very good, you've got the basics. We'll practice every day until it's second nature. They continued until Maeve's shoulder ached and her ears rang despite the cloth wadding Elias had provided. But by the time he called a halt, she could hit the target more often than not. That'll do for today, he said, taking the rifle. You did well, better than most people their first time. The praise, simple and genuine, warmed something in Maeve's chest. Thank you for teaching me. It's not charity, it's necessity. But his expression was softer than his words. Come on, you must be hungry. They ate lunch together at the heavy wooden table, bread and cheese and cold venison, washed down with creek water. Elias explained more about the property, about the rhythms of mountain life, about what would be expected as winter approached. We've got maybe 6 weeks before the first serious snow, he said. Maybe less. We need to use that time to finish preparations. More wood to split and stack, more meat to smoke. The chickens I ordered should arrive from Thornfield next week. We'll need to get the coop ready for them. And the garden plot needs to be turned and prepared for spring planting. That's a lot of work. It is, but there's 2 of us now. He looked at her directly. I won't lie to you, Maeve. The work is hard. The winters are harder. Some days you'll probably wonder why you didn't get back on that stagecoach and keep going. But if you can push through it, if you can adapt, this can be a good life. An honest one. Better than the alternative. What was the alternative? Maeve thought about the factory, the boarding house, the slow grinding down of hope and spirit that came from being unwanted and unnecessary. Disappearing, slowly, until there was nothing left of me but going through motions. Elias nodded slowly. I know that feeling. They finished the meal in companionable silence. Maeve helped clean up, learning where things belonged, how Elias organized his kitchen. It was intimate in a way she hadn't expected, this sharing of domestic space, this coordination of small tasks. The afternoon brought more lessons. Elias taught her how to maintain the fire, how to bank it for the night so it wouldn't go out but wouldn't burn too hot. He showed her the signs of changing weather in the clouds and wind. He explained which plants were safe to eat and which would kill her, pointing out examples as they walked the perimeter of the clearing. You're memorizing all this? He asked at one point, noting the way she repeated information back to herself under her breath. I had to memorize procedures at the factory. 27 steps for operating the loom, 34 for the folding machine. If you got them wrong, you could lose a hand. She touched a pine branch he'd indicated as useful for tea. This seems more important. It is. Out here, knowledge keeps you alive. As evening approached, they returned to the cabin. Elias started dinner while Maeve sat at the table, watching him work. He moved with surprising grace for someone so large, his hands capable of both violence and delicacy. She thought about those hands lifting her onto Storm, about the gentleness with which he'd adjusted her grip on the rifle, about the way he'd stacked wood earlier with careful precision. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Go ahead." "Why did you really choose me?" "The truth, not the practical reasons." Elias was quiet for a long moment, stirring something in a pot. "You want the whole truth?" "Yes." He set down the spoon and turned to face her. "Because when I looked at you standing there alone in that square, I saw myself. Not the surface things. Obviously, we're different that way. But the core of it. Being judged for something you can't control. Being made to feel like you're wrong just for existing. I've been there. I know what that does to a person." "So it was pity?" "No." His voice was firm. "It was recognition. There's a difference." He leaned against the counter, his dark eyes serious. "I don't pity you, Maeve. I respect you. You stood there and took their mockery without breaking. You got on that horse without knowing where you were going or what I'd do. You walked out here this morning and faced Vance without running. That's not someone who needs pity. That's someone who deserves respect." Maeve felt her throat tighten. "No one's ever said anything like that to me before." "Then you've been surrounded by fools." He returned to his cooking. "We're both too big for the world down there. Too different. Too uncomfortable for people who want everything neat and categorized. But up here?" He gestured at the walls, at the mountains beyond. "Up here, we fit just fine." They ate dinner as the sun set beyond the peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Elias told her about the land, about the seasons, about the animals they might see as winter approached. Maeve found herself relaxing, the tension of the day slowly draining away. After the meal, Elias built up the fire while Maeve washed dishes. When she finished, she found him sitting in one of the chairs near the hearth, a book open on his lap. "You read?" The question came out before she could stop it. He raised an eyebrow. "That's surprising?" Most men I knew didn't. Most men you knew were idiots." He held up the book, a worn copy of something she didn't recognize. "I've got about 40 books here. You're welcome to any of them." Maeve moved closer, studying the shelves he'd indicated. Poetry, philosophy, practical guides, novels, an eclectic collection that spoke to long winters and longer nights with nothing but firelight and words for company. "I like to read," she admitted. "When I had time, which wasn't often." "You'll have time now. Winter nights are long." He closed his book. "Maeve, we should talk about sleeping arrangements." Her heart lurched. "I thought you said—" "I did, and I meant it. You've got your room, but the cabin gets cold at night, really cold. The loft where I sleep stays warmest because heat rises." "Your room," he hesitated. "It's going to be uncomfortable once the temperature drops. I can pile blankets on you, but there's only so much that'll do." "What are you suggesting?" "That come winter, you might want to sleep upstairs. There's enough room for 2 bedrolls with space between. Separate, but warmer." He met her eyes. "It's your choice. Just wanted you to know the option exists before you spend a night freezing and think I was being cruel keeping the warm space to myself." Maeve processed this. The practical part of her understood the logic. Heat rises. 2 people generate more warmth than 1. Survival trumps propriety. But the part that had been mocked and rejected and made to feel ashamed of her body recoiled at the intimacy of it. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "Fair enough." Elias stood, stretching. "I'm turning in. Early start tomorrow. We need to begin on the woodshed." "Good night." "Good night, Maeve." She stayed by the fire after he climbed to the loft, listening to the settling sounds of the cabin, the pop and crackle of burning wood, the distant call of some night bird. Through the window, stars blazed in impossible numbers, so bright they cast shadows on the floor. Tomorrow would bring more work, more lessons, more adjustments to this strange new life. But tonight, in this moment, Maeve allowed herself to simply exist. Not too big, not too much, not wrong. Just herself, in a place that seemed willing to accept her exactly as she was. She touched her mother's locket through her dress, feeling its familiar weight. Her mother had been strong, they'd told her at the orphanage. Strong enough to give birth alone. Strong enough to survive 3 days before the fever took her. Strong enough to make sure her daughter was left somewhere safe, even if that safety came at the cost of being together. Maybe strength ran in the blood. Maybe Maeve had inherited more than just her mother's height and build. Maybe she'd inherited the ability to survive, to adapt, to find solid ground even when the world shifted beneath her feet. Up in the loft, she heard Elias moving around, settling into sleep. The sound should have been frightening. A strange man, so close, with all the power to hurt her if he chose. But somehow it wasn't. It was just another sound in this new symphony of her life, no more threatening than the wind in the pines or the rush of creek water. Maeve stood and moved to her room, closing the door softly behind her. She changed into her nightgown, braided her hair, and slipped between the blankets. The bed was comfortable enough, though Elias was right about the cold. Already she could feel it seeping through the walls, promising harsher nights ahead. But for now, she was warm enough, safe enough. And for the first time in her life, she was somewhere she'd chosen to be rather than somewhere circumstance had forced her. That counted for something, maybe everything. As sleep pulled her under, Maeve's last thought was of Elias's words. "You're exactly what I need, not despite who she was. Because of it." The difference was everything. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm of work and learning that left Maeve exhausted each night and stronger each morning. Her hands developed new calluses. Her muscles, already substantial from factory work, adapted to different demands: chopping, hauling, lifting, building. The boots that had been too large now fit properly, broken in by miles of walking the mountain terrain. She and Elias fell into an easy partnership built on necessity and mutual respect. He taught her to split wood with an axe that felt impossibly heavy at first, but gradually became manageable. She learned to stack it properly for drying, to recognize which pieces would burn hot and which would smolder. Together they prepared the chicken coop, reinforcing walls against predators and weather. When the chickens finally arrived, 6 hens and a rooster delivered by a nervous trader who clearly wanted nothing to do with Elias Crow, Maeve found herself oddly delighted by their presence, their busy clucking bringing life to the homestead. The shooting lessons continued daily. Maeve's accuracy improved until she could hit targets at 50 yards more often than not. Elias taught her to clean the rifle, to load it quickly, to treat it with the respect deadly things deserved. He was a patient teacher, correcting without criticism, praising progress without excessive sentiment. They talked more as the days passed, over meals, during work breaks, in the evenings by the fire. Elias spoke little about his past beyond what he'd already shared, but he was generous with knowledge about the present, the mountains, the weather patterns, the animals they might encounter. Maeve, in turn, found herself sharing stories from the orphanage and the factory, things she'd kept locked away for years. He listened without judgment, without pity, just steady attention that made her feel heard in ways she never had before. The cold came earlier than expected. One morning Maeve woke to find frost coating her window, beautiful and foreboding. She dressed quickly, her breath visible in the frigid air, and emerged to find Elias already stoking the fire to a roar. "First frost," he said without preamble. "We've got maybe 2 weeks before snow. Need to accelerate the preparations." The work intensified. They rose before dawn and worked past dusk, racing against the approaching winter. More wood was split and stacked until the shed overflowed, and they started a second pile under waterproof canvas. Elias took Maeve hunting, teaching her to track deer, to move quietly through the forest, to take a clean shot that would kill quickly and humanely. She missed her first 3 attempts, but the 4th brought down a young buck that provided meat for the smokehouse and a lesson in butchering that left her hands stained and her stomach queasy but her mind sharp with new knowledge. "You did well," Elias said as they worked side by side, cutting the venison into strips for drying. "Most people can't handle this part." "I worked in a factory that processed wool," Maeve replied, focusing on her knife work. "I've seen worse." "Still, taking a life, even for food, should mean something. The fact that it bothers you means you're not callous to it." She glanced at him. "Does it bother you?" "Every time. But I do it anyway because the alternative is starving." He set aside a section of meat, The mountain doesn't care about our feelings. It just is. We have to match it or die. That night, Maeve's room was so cold she could see her breath despite the blankets piled on her bed. She lay shivering for an hour before finally admitting defeat. Wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, she climbed the ladder to the loft. Elias was still awake, reading by candlelight. He looked up when her head appeared above the floor level, his expression unsurprised. "Cold?" he asked. "Freezing." "Told you." He closed his book and gestured to the space he'd clearly prepared. A second bedroll laid out on the opposite side of the loft, a good 6 feet from his own. "It's warmer up here. Not comfortable, but survivable." Maeve climbed the rest of the way up and settled into the bedroll, relief flooding through her as she felt the warmth that had risen and pooled in the loft space. It wasn't luxurious, but compared to her room below, it felt like heaven. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Practical necessity. Can't have you freezing to death because you were too proud to ask for help." He blew out the candle, plunging the loft into darkness. "Good night, Maeve." "Good night." She lay awake for a while, hyper-aware of his presence across the small space, but his breathing soon evened out into sleep, and the warmth and exhaustion pulled her under as well. When she woke in the morning, he was already gone, the smell of coffee and frying bacon drifting up from below. The routine continued. Work during the day, shooting practice in the afternoon, shared meals, and quiet evenings. Maeve moved her few belongings up to the loft, abandoning her cold room without ceremony. The arrangement was chaste, practical, and somehow more intimate than anything she'd experienced. This sharing of space in the darkness, the sound of another person breathing, the knowledge that they were partners in survival. She was cleaning the breakfast dishes one morning when she heard Storm whinny sharply from the barn. Not her usual greeting sound, but something urgent, alarmed. Maeve's hand stilled in the wash water. Elias heard it too. He was on his feet instantly, moving to the window with the rifle he now kept within easy reach. His entire body had gone tense, predator alert. "What is it?" Maeve whispered. "Don't know yet. Stay quiet." They waited, the cabin silent except for the tick of the clock and Maeve's too loud heartbeat. Then voices drifted across the clearing, rough and male, and deliberately loud. "Crow, we know you're in there." Elias's jaw tightened. "Vance!" Maeve's blood went cold. She'd almost forgotten about the men from weeks ago, had let herself believe they'd been a single incident, a warning that had passed. But the voice outside carried a weight that said otherwise. "You and I need to have a conversation," Vance called, "about property rights and neighborly respect." Elias moved to the door, opening it just enough to be seen but keeping the wall as cover. Maeve positioned herself where she could see through the window. In the clearing, 5 men sat on horses, Vance and the 2 from before, plus 2 new faces equally hard and dangerous looking. "You're still on my land," Elias said, his voice carrying across the distance. "Still not welcome." "See, that's the thing." Vance leaned forward in his saddle, his scarred face split by a smile that had nothing to do with humor. "We've been doing some research. Turns out this land you're squatting on, it's not actually filed with the territory office, which means it's up for grabs. I've been here 7 years. That makes it mine by settlement rights." "Settlement rights require paperwork, Crow. Forms, official stamps." Vance's smile widened. "Forms you never filed because you're too proud or too stupid or too much of a hermit to deal with civilized processes. So as far as the law's concerned, this land is unclaimed, and we're claiming it." Maeve saw Elias's hand tighten on the rifle. "The law's 3 days' ride from here. By the time you could get anyone official up here, I'd have all the paperwork filed and witnessed." "Maybe. Or maybe you'd have an unfortunate accident before then. Lots of dangerous things in these mountains. Bears, cliffs, bullets." Vance's tone turned cold. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack up your things and that woman of yours, and you're going to leave. Today. Right now. And we're going to pretend this conversation never happened." "No." "No?" Vance laughed, and his men joined in. "You're outnumbered 5 to 1, Crow. And that's assuming your woman can fight, which I doubt. You really want to die over some dirt and timber? It's not the dirt, it's the principle." Elias's voice was flat, final. "This is my home. You're not taking it." Then we'll take it from your corpse. What happened next occurred too fast for Maeve to fully process. Vance reached for his weapon. Elias brought up his rifle in one smooth motion. The crack of gunfire split the air, and Vance's hat flew off his head, spinning away into the dust. Next one's not a warning, Elias said calmly, already chambering another round. Vance's face went purple with rage. Kill him! The men went for their guns. Elias fired again, the shot taking down the horse of the man on Vance's left. The animal screamed and went down, throwing its rider. Return fire peppered the cabin wall, splintering wood, forcing Elias back from the door. Maeve acted on instinct. She grabbed the second rifle, the one Elias had given her to practice with, which she'd cleaned and loaded that morning out of habit, and moved to the window. Through the glass, she could see the men spreading out, trying to flank the cabin. One was moving toward the barn, toward Storm. She broke the window with the rifle barrel, sighted along the barrel the way Elias had taught her, breathed out slowly, and fired. The shot hit the ground 3 feet in front of the man heading for the barn. He jerked back, his horse rearing. Maeve chambered another round, her hand steady despite her racing heart, and fired again. This one came closer, close enough to make the man wheel his horse around and retreat toward the others. "That's it," Elias called from the doorway, pride and surprise mixing in his voice. "Keep them back from the outbuildings." The fight became chaos. Gunfire cracked back and forth across the clearing, bullets thudding into wood and whining off stone. Maeve fired methodically, not trying to kill. She wasn't sure she could, wasn't sure she wanted that weight on her soul, but keeping the men away from anything that mattered. Elias was doing the opposite, his shots precise and deadly when they needed to be, warning when they could be. One of Vance's men took a bullet through the shoulder and went down screaming. Another's horse was hit and had to be put down, leaving the rider scrambling for cover. The man Elias had unhorsed first tried to rush the cabin door and took a round through the thigh for his trouble. "Fall back!" Vance screamed, his earlier confidence shattered by unexpected resistance. "Fall back!" But Elias wasn't giving them the chance. He stepped out onto the porch, fully exposed, and fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The first knocked the gun from one man's hand, the second hit another in the leg. The third punched through Vance's saddle, barely missing the man himself. "You want this land?" Elias roared, his voice echoing off the mountain slopes. "Come and take it, but you'll die trying." Maeve kept firing, her shoulder bruising from the rifle's kick, her ears ringing from the noise. But she didn't stop, didn't falter, didn't let fear override training. She remembered everything Elias had taught her. Breathe, sight, squeeze, chamber, repeat. The rifle became an extension of her will, her determination to protect this place that had become something precious. The fight couldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When Vance finally got his panicking men under control and retreated, they left behind wounded, screaming horses, blood on the ground, and the clear understanding that the mountain man and his woman were not going to be easy prey. "This isn't over," Vance shouted from the tree line. "You hear me, Crow? This isn't over." "Then come back," Elias called back. "Come back as many times as you want. The answer's going to be the same." The thunder of hooves faded into distance. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the labored breathing of the wounded horses and the ringing in Maeve's ears. She stood at the broken window, rifle still raised, her whole body shaking now that the danger had passed. "Maeve," Elias's voice was gentle. "You can lower the gun now. They're gone." She did, her arms trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline crash. The rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She set it down carefully, afraid she might drop it, and turned to find Elias watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You all right?" he asked. I think so." "You?" "Fine. Not hit." He moved to her, checking her over with his eyes, making sure. "You did good, real good. Kept them off the barn, protected our flank. That was smart thinking." "I just did what you taught me." "No. You did more than that." He touched her shoulder briefly, a fleeting contact that felt like approval and gratitude combined. "You fought for this place, for us. That means something." Maeve looked out at the clearing, at the evidence of violence that would need to be cleaned up. 2 horses would have to be put down, their suffering ended. Blood would have to be scrubbed away. The cabin wall would need repair. And Vance's threat still hung in the air like smoke. They'll come back, she said quietly. Probably, but we'll be ready. Elias moved to the door, surveying the damage. I need to ride to Thornfield tomorrow, file those papers Vance mentioned. Make this legal and official so there's no question. Can it wait? What if they come back while you're gone? They won't. They're licking their wounds, regrouping. We've got a few days at least. He looked at her seriously. But I need you to promise me something. What? If they do come back while I'm gone, you don't try to fight them alone. You take Storm and you run. Ride for Thornfield. Find the sheriff. Bring help. Don't be a hero. Maeve wanted to argue, wanted to insist she could defend the cabin herself. But she wasn't foolish enough to believe 5 armed men could be held off by one woman, no matter how well trained. I promise, she said finally. Good. He handed her his rifle. Keep this close, and keep the door barred until I get back. They spent the rest of the day dealing with the aftermath. Elias put down the wounded horses quickly and efficiently, then dragged the carcasses away from the cabin where scavengers would take care of them. Maeve scrubbed blood from the porch, repaired the broken window with oiled paper since they had no glass, and made an inventory of their ammunition, which had been depleted more than she'd like. That evening, they ate a somber dinner. The violence had shaken something loose in both of them. The understanding that this life, this place, came with costs that went beyond hard work and cold winters. I'm sorry, Elias said abruptly. Maeve looked up from her plate. For what? For bringing you into this. For putting you in danger. He met her eyes. When I chose you in that square, I thought I was offering you a better life. But this? He gestured at the damaged wall, at the world beyond. This might be worse than what you left. No, Maeve said firmly. In Boston, I was dying slowly, ground down a little more each day. Here, at least I'm fighting, at least I matter, at least I'm living instead of just existing. You could have been killed today. But I wasn't, we weren't. She leaned forward. Elias, I'm not some delicate flower that needs to be protected from the harsh realities of the world. I've seen harsh realities. I've lived them. This, she gestured around the cabin, this is the first time I've ever had something worth fighting for. Don't apologize for that. Something shifted in his expression, a wall coming down that she hadn't even known was there. You're remarkable. You know that? Heat flooded Maeve's face. I'm just doing what needs to be done. That's what makes you remarkable. Most people can't. He stood, collecting their plates. Get some rest. I want to leave at first light, which means you'll be alone here all day tomorrow and probably the next. You sure you'll be all right? I'll be fine. I've got Storm, the chickens, and enough ammunition to fight off a small army. Let's hope it doesn't come to that. That night in the loft, Maeve lay awake long after Elias's breathing had evened into sleep. Her mind replayed the fight, the feel of the rifle in her hands, the moment when she'd made the choice to pull that trigger. She'd hurt no one, killed nothing, but she'd been willing to. She'd been ready to. The realization didn't frighten her as much as it should have. Maybe the mountain was changing her, reshaping her into someone harder, stronger, more capable of survival. Or maybe it was just revealing who she'd always been under the layers of shame and self-doubt the world had heaped on her. She turned her head, looking across the loft to where Elias slept. In the faint moonlight filtering through the window, she could make out his profile. Strong, solid, at peace in a way he never quite was while awake. This man who'd chosen her when no one else would, who'd taught her to shoot, to survive, to believe she was worth defending. They'd become partners in truth, not just in name. Two people who didn't fit anywhere else, building something together on this mountainside that was entirely their own. Morning came too quickly. Elias rose before dawn, moving quietly around the cabin as he prepared for the journey to Thornfield. Maeve woke and dressed, coming down to find him packing supplies into Storm's saddlebags. There's food prepared, he said. Enough for 2 days, plus emergency rations in the cellar if you need them. Don't let the fire go out. Keep the rifles loaded. And remember, if they come back, I run, Maeve finished. I know, I remember. He studied her face in the dim lamplight. I'll be back as quick as I can. Day and a half there, few hours in town, day and a half back. 3 days at most. I'll be fine. I know you will. He surprised her by reaching out and squeezing her hand briefly. "You're stronger than you think, Maeve O'Connor." Then he was gone, riding out of the clearing as the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern peaks. Maeve stood on the porch and watched until he disappeared into the trees, then turned back to face the cabin alone. The day passed slowly. Maeve kept busy with chores, feeding the chickens, collecting eggs, chopping wood, maintaining the fire. She practiced with the rifle, running through the loading and sighting drills until they were second nature. She cooked a simple dinner and ate it at the big table, the silence of the cabin pressing in around her. Night fell. She barred the door, checked the windows, and climbed to the loft with both rifles. Sleep came in fits and starts, her mind jumping at every sound: wind in the pines, an owl's call, the scuttle of some small creature on the roof. The second day was worse. The solitude that had seemed peaceful yesterday now felt oppressive. Maeve found herself talking to the chickens, to Storm, to the empty air, just to hear a voice. She understood now why Elias had needed a partner, why isolation could grind a person down to nothing. Afternoon was fading to evening when she heard it. Hoofbeats, approaching from the direction of the trail. Her heart leaped. Elias, back early. But the rhythm was wrong. Too many horses, moving too fast. Maeve grabbed both rifles and ran to the window. Through the trees, she caught glimpses of riders, 5 of them, charging toward the cabin with weapons drawn. Vance had come back, and she was alone. Terror flooded through her, cold and paralyzing. Every instinct screamed at her to hide, to make herself small, to disappear. But Elias's voice echoed in her memory. "If they come back, you run." Maeve burst out the back door, sprinting for the barn. Behind her, she heard shouts as the men realized someone was there. Bullets whined past, slamming into trees and dirt. She ran harder than she'd ever run, her lungs burning, the rifles banging against her back. Storm was already agitated, sensing danger. Maeve didn't bother with a saddle, just grabbed the horse's mane and hauled herself up with strength born of pure desperation. She kicked Storm's flanks, and the big mare bolted from the barn at a dead run. More gunfire. A bullet creased Storm's hindquarter, making the horse scream and surge forward even faster. They crashed through the tree line and onto the mountain trail, Storm's hooves pounding on stone, carrying Maeve away from the cabin, from the men, from safety, and toward help that was a day and a half distant. Behind her, she heard pursuit. They were coming. They wouldn't give up. And she was racing toward darkness with nothing but terror and determination driving her forward. The mountain trail blurred past, Storm's powerful body moving beneath her in a rhythm of pure survival. Maeve clung to the horse's mane, her fingers cramped and aching, her whole body focused on one thing, staying alive long enough to find Elias. The men behind her were gaining. Their horses were fresh while Storm was already wounded and carrying weight. It was only a matter of time before they caught up. But Maeve had learned something these past weeks. She'd learned that she was stronger than she'd thought, braver than she'd believed. Worth fighting for, worth defending, worth something. And she'd learned that sometimes survival meant refusing to give up even when the odds said you should. So she urged Storm faster, deeper into the gathering darkness, toward hope and help, and the man who'd taught her she was worth saving. The chase continued into night, and Maeve held on with everything she had. Storm stumbled on a patch of loose scree, her injured hindquarter making her gait uneven. Maeve felt the horse's strength faltering beneath her, felt the hot blood seeping through her dress where she gripped with her thighs. The mare was giving everything she had, but it wasn't going to be enough. The hoofbeats behind them were getting closer. Any moment now, they'd be within shooting range again, and this time there would be no cabin walls for cover, no second rifle, no Elias firing back. Just Maeve, alone on a wounded horse, racing through mountain darkness toward help that might as well be on the moon. She made a decision born of desperation and the tactical thinking Elias had drilled into her over weeks of preparation. The main trail descended in long switchbacks, easy to follow, but predictable. But there was another route, barely a deer path, treacherous even in daylight, cutting straight down the mountainside through dense forest. Elias had shown it to her once, warning her never to take it unless she had no other choice. Maeve yanked on Storm's mane, guiding the horse off the main trail. The mare resisted for a heartbeat, sensing the danger, then plunged into the darkness between the trees. Branches whipped at Maeve's face, tearing at her clothes and hair. Storm's hooves slipped on pine needles and exposed roots, But the horse somehow kept her footing, driven by the same survival instinct that propelled them both. Behind them, confusion erupted. The pursuing riders had lost sight of their quarry. Maeve heard shouting, the sound of horses being reined in hard. Where'd she go? The trail splits here. She didn't split off. She went straight into the damn forest. In the dark? She'll break her neck. Then let's make sure of it. Fan out. But the trees were too dense for horses running at speed. Maeve heard the pursuers slow, heard them curse and argue about the wisdom of following. She didn't wait to hear more. She urged Storm deeper into the forest, trusting the horse's instincts more than her own failing vision. They descended through a nightmare landscape of shadow and uncertain footing. Twice Storm nearly went down, her legs buckling before recovering at the last possible moment. Maeve clung to the horse's neck, making herself as small a burden as possible, whispering encouragement that was as much for herself as for the animal. Come on, girl, come on, just a little farther. You can do this. We can do this. The sounds of pursuit faded. Either they'd given up or they'd lost the trail entirely. Maeve didn't dare hope for the former, so she kept moving, kept pushing, kept descending through the black forest toward the valley below. Time lost meaning. All that existed was the next step, the next breath, the next moment of not falling or dying or being caught. Maeve's hands were slick with Storm's blood, and her own where branches had torn her palms. Her dress was in tatters. Every muscle screamed with exhaustion. Then the trees began to thin, the ground leveled out, and suddenly they were stumbling into a clearing lit by moonlight, and Maeve could see the ribbon of the main trail 100 yards ahead, and beyond it the distant lights of what had to be Thornfield. Storm took 3 more steps and collapsed. Maeve hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs. For a moment she just lay there, stunned and gasping, staring up at stars that wheeled overhead in dizzying patterns. Then training overrode shock. She rolled to her feet, ignoring the pain, and stumbled to where Storm had fallen. The horse was still breathing, but clearly done. The wound on her hindquarter had bled freely during the run, and combined with exhaustion, it had pushed the animal past her limits. Maeve's heart broke looking at the loyal creature who'd carried her to safety. "I'm sorry," she whispered, stroking Storm's neck. "I'm so sorry. I'll get help. I promise. I'll come back for you." Storm's eye rolled to look at her, and Maeve could have sworn the horse understood. Then the mare closed her eyes, her breathing evening out into something that might have been sleep or might have been the prelude to death. Maeve grabbed both rifles and started running. Her legs were liquid, her lungs burned with every breath. But she ran anyway, driven by desperation and the knowledge that Vance and his men were somewhere behind her in the darkness. The main trail was easier going, and she made better time, but every shadow looked like a threat, every sound like approaching danger. The lights of Thornfield grew closer. Individual buildings became visible. She could hear piano music drifting from the saloon, the murmur of voices, the normal sounds of a town settling in for the night. Civilization. Safety. Help. Maeve burst into town like something wild, her destroyed dress hanging in strips, her hair loose and tangled with debris, blood streaking her arms and face. She must have looked like a madwoman or a ghost, because the few people still on the street stopped and stared in shock. "Elias Crow," she gasped out, her voice raw. "Where is he? I need Elias Crow." "My God," a woman breathed. "It's that bride, the one he took." "She looks half dead." "What happened to you, girl?" But Maeve didn't have time for questions. She grabbed the nearest man by his shirt front with strength that made him stumble backward. "Elias Crow. Where?" The land office," the man stammered. "He was there earlier filing papers. Might still be—" Maeve was already running again, following the man's pointed finger toward a building with a lit window. She crashed through the door without knocking, startling 2 men who'd been bent over a desk covered in documents. Elias's head snapped up. For a fraction of a second, his face went through a dozen expressions: shock, fear, rage, relief, before settling into something cold and deadly. "Maeve!" He was across the room in 3 strides, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for injuries. "What happened? Are you hurt?" "Vance," she panted. "They came back, 5 of them. I ran like you said, storm's down, maybe half a mile out. They were chasing us. I don't know where they are now. The other man, an older gentleman in a clerk's vest, stood up in alarm. Vance and his gang attacked you? They attacked my property, Elias said, his voice flat and dangerous, with my wife inside. Now hold on, the clerk began. We can't just get the sheriff, Elias commanded. Now. Tell him Vance finally crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Tell him there are witnesses this time, testimony, evidence of attempted murder and claim jumping. But the sheriff's over in, then get whoever's deputized. Get anyone with a gun and a shred of decency. Because I'm riding back up that mountain tonight, and anyone with sense will want to be on my side when I do. The clerk fled. Elias turned back to Maeve, his hands gentle despite the fury in his eyes. Are you hurt? Tell me straight. Cuts and bruises, nothing serious, but Storm took a bullet and she went down hard. Maeve felt tears threatening for the first time since the attack started. I had to leave her. She saved my life, and I had to leave her. You did exactly right. Elias pulled her against his chest, one hand cradling the back of her head. You did everything right. You survived. That's all that matters. Maeve let herself lean into him for just a moment, let herself take strength from his solid presence. Then she pulled back, wiping at her eyes. The cabin. They might have burned it, taken everything. Then we'll rebuild, but we're not letting them keep it. His jaw was set in lines that promised violence. They made a mistake coming after you, a fatal one. Over the next hour, Thornfield mobilized in a way Maeve wouldn't have thought possible. The deputy sheriff, a weathered man named Cole, arrived with 4 other men willing to ride out. Mayor Garrett appeared, blustering about due process, until Elias fixed him with a look that made him swallow whatever else he'd been about to say. Even Tucker, the man who'd rejected Maeve so publicly, showed up armed and ready, though he couldn't quite meet her eyes. Whatever Vance is doing up there is bad for all of us, Tucker muttered when questioned. Can't have men thinking they can just take what they want. A doctor tended to Maeve's cuts while Elias conferred with Cole and the others, planning their approach. They'd ride out in force, retrieve Storm if she still lived, and then continue to the cabin to drive Vance off permanently. Whether that meant arrest or killing, no one said explicitly, but the intent was clear in the weapons being loaded and the grim set of every jaw. You're staying here, Elias told Maeve when the preparations were complete. No. Maeve, you're exhausted, you're hurt, you've done enough. It's my home too. She stood up, testing her bandaged hands. I'm coming. This could turn into a bloodbath. Then it already has. I shot at them, Elias. I fought for that cabin. I'm not hiding in town while you finish what we both started. They stared at each other, wills clashing. Finally, Elias nodded once, sharp and final. You ride with me. You stay close. And if I tell you to run, you run. No arguments. No arguments. Someone had brought a fresh horse for Maeve, a sturdy gelding that looked capable of handling rough terrain. She mounted with Elias's help, her body protesting every movement but her determination overriding the pain. The group rode out under cold stars, 8 riders armed and angry, heading up into the mountains. They found Storm where Maeve had left her. The horse was still alive, lying on her side, her breathing labored. Elias dismounted and went to her, his large hands gentle as he examined the wound. It's not as bad as it looks, he said after a moment. Bullet grazed her. Lots of blood, but no deep damage. The fall didn't break anything. She's just exhausted. He looked at 2 of the townsmen. Can you stay with her? Keep her calm and warm. We'll collect her on the way back. They agreed, and the remaining 6 riders continued up the mountain. As they climbed higher, evidence of Maeve's desperate flight became visible. Broken branches, disturbed earth, places where Storm had slipped and recovered. Elias rode in silence, but Maeve could feel the tension radiating from him, could see the way his hand never strayed far from his rifle. There, Deputy Cole said softly, pointing ahead where orange light flickered through the trees. Fire. They dismounted and proceeded on foot, moving with the careful quiet of men who'd hunted before. Maeve stayed close to Elias, her rifle ready, her heart hammering but her hands steady. Through the trees, the cabin came into view, and relief flooded through her so intensely she nearly stumbled. It was still standing, the barn too, Nothing had been burned, nothing destroyed. Vance and his men had made camp in the clearing, clearly planning to wait out the night before ransacking the place at dawn. 4 men sat around a fire, passing a bottle between them, their horses picketed nearby. Vance himself was examining the cabin door, testing its strength. "Cocky bastards," Cole whispered. "Think they've already won." Elias's smile was cold as winter ice. "Let's teach them different." The plan was simple and direct. Circle around, cut off escape routes, then announce their presence and give Vance one chance to surrender. If he refused, they'd take the cabin back by force. Maeve moved with the others, positioning herself behind a large pine tree with a clear line of sight to the clearing. When everyone was in place, Deputy Cole's voice rang out sharp and authoritative. "Vance, you and your men are surrounded. Put down your weapons and come out with your hands visible." Chaos erupted. The men around the fire scrambled for their guns. Vance spun toward the voice, his face contorting with rage when he realized they weren't alone. For a moment, Maeve thought he might actually comply. Then he grabbed his rifle and fired blindly into the trees. The night exploded into violence. Gunfire cracked from multiple directions. The townsmen had better position in numbers, but Vance's gang had desperation and the cover of the cabin to hide behind. Bullets whined through the air, thudding into wood and earth. One of Vance's men went down in the first volley, clutching his leg and screaming. Another tried to reach the horses and took a round through the shoulder. Maeve sighted carefully and fired at a man trying to flank Cole's position. The shot went wide, but close enough to make the target dive for cover. She chambered another round, breathing the way Elias had taught her, finding her calm in the center of the chaos. Elias moved like something elemental. He wasn't hiding, wasn't cowering behind trees. He walked into the clearing with his rifle raised, firing with mechanical precision. One shot. One man down, weapon flying from his hand. Another shot. Another target eliminated, crying out as his knee shattered. "Enough!" Elias roared. "It's over, Vance! Your men are down! Surrender now or join them!" But Vance, cornered and furious, made the choice men like him always made when threatened. He raised his rifle and pointed it straight at Elias. Maeve didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't question. She just moved, stepping out from behind her tree, raising her rifle, and firing in one smooth motion. The bullet caught Vance in the hand, gripping his weapon. He screamed and dropped the rifle, clutching his mangled fingers. Before he could reach for another gun, Elias was on him, driving the butt of his rifle into Vance's temple hard enough to drop him like a stone. Silence fell over the clearing, broken only by the moans of wounded men and the ringing in Maeve's ears. She stood frozen, her rifle still raised, staring at what she'd done. She'd shot a man. Not to wound, not to warn, but to stop him from killing. The weight of it settled over her like a physical thing. "Clear," Cole called out, emerging from the trees. "All of them down or surrendered?" Elias looked across the clearing at Maeve. Their eyes met, and something passed between them that needed no words. He'd seen what she'd done, understood why she'd done it. And in his expression, she saw not judgment, but gratitude, respect, and something deeper she couldn't quite name. He crossed to her in long strides. "You all right?" "I shot him." "You saved my life." "I shot him," she repeated, needing him to understand the magnitude of what had happened. "I pulled the trigger and I shot another human being." "You did what had to be done." Elias gently lowered her rifle. "You protected what was yours. Protected me. There's no shame in that." Maeve looked at Vance, unconscious on the ground, his hand a bloody mess. At the other men, wounded but alive, being secured by the townsmen. At her home, still standing, still whole, defended and reclaimed. "I'm not sorry," she said, realizing it was true. "I'm not sorry I did it." "Good. Because you shouldn't be." Elias squeezed her shoulder. "Come on, let's check the cabin." The interior was untouched. Vance had been confident enough in his victory that he hadn't bothered forcing entry yet. Everything was exactly as Maeve had left it. Dishes from her interrupted dinner still on the table, the fire burned down to embers but not out. Her belongings undisturbed. She walked through the space slowly, touching familiar things, reassuring herself it was all still real. Elias followed, saying nothing, just giving her the time she needed to process. "They're taking the prisoners back to Thornfield," Cole said from the doorway. We'll charge them with attempted murder, theft, assault. They'll be locked up for a good long while. He looked at Maeve with something like respect. Ma'am, I owe you an apology. We all do. The way folks treated you when you arrived, that wasn't right. But you've proven yourself tonight, proven you belong here. Maeve turned to face him. I don't need to prove anything to anyone, not anymore. Cole nodded slowly. No, ma'am, I don't suppose you do. He tipped his hat. We'll be heading back now. You two take care. When they were alone, Elias rebuilt the fire while Maeve changed out of her ruined dress into fresh clothes. Her hands shook with delayed reaction, but she forced them steady. She'd survived. They'd survived. The cabin was theirs, legally filed and defended with blood. We should go collect Storm, she said. Already sent Tucker and another man to bring her up. They'll take it slow, let her rest when she needs to. Elias looked at her seriously. Maeve, about what happened tonight. Don't. She held up a hand. Don't tell me I shouldn't have come. Don't tell me I shouldn't have fought. Don't tell me I should have stayed safe in town. I was going to say thank you. His voice was quiet. For saving my life. For defending our home. For being exactly the partner I knew you could be. The words hit her harder than she'd expected. Our home. Not his cabin she lived in, not his property she helped maintain. Theirs. Built together, defended together, claimed together. You're welcome, she said softly. They stood in the firelight, looking at each other across the space that had become their shared life. Maeve thought about the woman she'd been in that square just weeks ago. Ashamed, defeated, convinced of her own worthlessness. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. I've been thinking, Elias said, about what you said earlier, about not being sorry for what you did. And I realized you're right. We shouldn't apologize for protecting what's ours, for being willing to fight for it. He paused. But that means accepting what we've become, what this place has made us. What have we become? Dangerous. He said it simply, factually. People who can and will use violence to defend what matters. That's not something to take lightly. Maeve considered this. No, but it's also not something to be ashamed of. The world is what it is. We're just adapting to survive in it. You sound like you belong here now. Maybe I do. She moved to the window, looking out at the clearing where evidence of the fight still remained. I don't fit in towns, Elias. I never have. Too big, too strange, too different. But here I fit fine. Here I'm exactly what's needed. Here you're home. She turned to look at him. Yes, home. The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just shelter or convenience or a practical arrangement anymore. Somewhere between the shooting lessons and the shared meals and the nights in the loft and the fight to defend these walls, it had become something more, something real. Outside, she heard horses approaching, Tucker and the other man returning with Storm. Elias went to help them settle the wounded horse in the barn, while Maeve started heating water for tea, needing something normal and domestic to ground her after the violence. When Elias returned, he found her sitting at the table with 2 cups poured, waiting. He took the seat across from her, accepting the tea with a nod of thanks. Storm's going to be fine, he reported. Clean wound, no infection. She'll be sore for a while, but she'll heal. Good. She deserves to recover. She saved my life. We all saved each other tonight. Elias wrapped his hands around his cup. Maeve, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest. All right. Do you want to stay? Really stay, I mean. Not because you have nowhere else to go or because you're afraid to leave, but because you actually want this life, this place, this partnership. Maeve didn't answer immediately. The question deserved real thought, honest examination. She looked around the cabin, at the books on their shelves, at the rifles she'd used to defend her home, at the loft where they slept in separate bedrolls that had somehow become the most intimate thing she'd ever experienced. She thought about the chickens clucking outside, about Storm recovering in the barn, about mountains that demanded strength and gave belonging in return. Yes, she said finally, I want to stay. Not because I have to, because I choose to. Because for the first time in my life, I'm somewhere I matter. Somewhere I'm valued for exactly who I am. Somewhere I'm building something that's mine. Ours, Elias corrected gently. Ours, she agreed. He reached across the table and took her hand, the one that had pulled a trigger tonight, that bore fresh cuts and old calluses, that was strong and scarred and capable. His own hand, equally marked by work and violence and survival, enclosed hers completely. Then we do this properly, he said. No more halfway measures. We're partners in everything, the work, the danger, the decisions, the life. Equal say, equal weight, equal standing. You're not my helper or my burden or my responsibility. You're my partner. And you're mine. They sat like that for a long moment, hands clasped, eyes locked, understanding flowing between them without need for more words. Outside, the mountain wind whispered through the pines. Inside, the fire crackled and warmth spread through the cabin that had become their fortress, their sanctuary, their home. Eventually, they climbed to the loft together, exhaustion finally claiming them both. Maeve settled into her bedroll and Elias into his, the familiar space between them maintained. But somehow tonight it felt different. Not like distance, but like respect. Not like separation, but like the conscious choice to preserve something worth preserving. "Good night, Maeve," Elias said in the darkness. "Good night." She closed her eyes, her body aching in a dozen places, her mind still replaying the night's events. But underneath the pain and adrenaline crash, she felt something solid and unshakable, certainty. This was where she belonged. This was who she was meant to become. And the man sleeping across the loft was exactly who she was meant to become it with. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The wound on her palm would need tending. Storm would need careful nursing. There would be questions from town, probably a formal inquiry about the fight. Winter was still approaching and preparations were behind schedule, but they would handle it. Together. As partners. As people who'd proven they could defend what mattered, who could adapt and survive and build something worth fighting for. Maeve drifted toward sleep with her hand still tingling from where Elias had held it, and for the first time since arriving in these mountains, she felt not just accepted or tolerated, but truly, deeply valued. The woman who'd stood alone in that square being mocked was gone. In her place was someone stronger, fiercer, more certain of her own worth. And that woman was finally, completely home. Morning arrived with the clarity that comes after storms, both literal and metaphorical. Maeve woke to find pale sunlight streaming through the loft window and the smell of coffee drifting up from below. Her body ached in ways that made yesterday's violence undeniably real, but her mind felt strangely peaceful, settled in a way it hadn't been since arriving at the cabin. She descended the ladder to find Elias at the stove, cooking breakfast with the focused efficiency she'd come to recognize as his way of processing difficult things. He looked up when he heard her, and something in his expression made her pause halfway across the room. "Storm's fever broke overnight," he said. "I checked on her at dawn. She was standing, drinking water. She's going to be fine." Relief washed through Maeve so intensely she had to grip the back of a chair. Thank goodness. More than that, it's a sign. Elias plated food and gestured for her to sit. Everything we fought for survived. The cabin, the animals, each other. We won, Maeve, completely. They ate in comfortable silence, the kind that only develops between people who've been tested together and come through intact. Maeve's bandaged hands made cutting difficult, and without asking, Elias reached over and cut her meat into manageable pieces. The gesture was so casual, so domestic, that it made her throat tight. "Deputy Cole will probably come by today," Elias said. "Need to give formal statements about what happened. But the paperwork's filed in Thornfield. This land is ours, legally and officially. Vance can't touch it, even if he gets out of jail someday." "Will he? Get out?" "Eventually. But he'll be an old man by then, and he'll know better than to come back here." Elias's expression hardened slightly. "Word spreads fast in these mountains. What you did last night, standing your ground, fighting back, shooting to protect, that'll be talked about for years. No one's going to underestimate either of us again." Maeve thought about this. Is that good or bad? It's necessary. Respect and fear are what keep people alive out here. We've earned both now. After breakfast, they walked to the barn together to check on Storm. The horse greeted them with a soft nicker, her eyes bright and alert despite the bandaging on her hindquarter. Maeve spent several minutes stroking the mare's neck, murmuring thanks and apologies in equal measure. "She doesn't blame you," Elias said, watching them. "Animals understand survival better than people do. She knows you did what had to be done." "I keep thinking about what would have happened if she'd gone down earlier, if I hadn't made it to town." "But you did. That's what matters." He leaned against the stall door. "You know what I realized last night? When I saw you come through that door all torn up and bleeding, I wasn't thinking about the cabin or the land or any of it. I was just terrified something had happened to you." Maeve turned to look at him. "Elias, let me finish." He met her eyes directly. "When I chose you in that square, I told myself it was practical, that I needed a partner who could handle mountain life. And that was true. But somewhere along the way, it became more than that. You became more than that." Her heart was beating too fast. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I don't want separate bedrolls anymore. I don't want to pretend this is just a practical arrangement. I don't want to keep calling you my wife in name only." He moved closer, his voice dropping. "I'm saying I want this to be real, if you do." Maeve had imagined this moment in 100 different ways over the past weeks. Awkward, uncomfortable, forced. But standing here in the morning light with this man who'd taught her to value herself, who'd stood beside her through violence and fear, who'd chosen her when no one else would, and then proven himself worthy of being chosen in return, it felt natural. "Right. I want it to be real too," she said quietly. Elias reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted. When she didn't, he cupped her face in his large, scarred hands with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "You're sure? Because once we cross this line, there's no going back to what we were." "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward." He kissed her then, soft and careful, like she was something precious rather than something to be conquered. Maeve's hands came up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. The kiss deepened gradually, carefully, both of them learning this new aspect of their partnership with the same patience they'd brought to everything else. When they finally pulled apart, Elias rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought I'd find someone who fit so perfectly into this life. Into my life. I never thought anyone would want me to." "Then we were both fools." He smiled, and it transformed his usually serious face into something warm and open. "But we're smarter now." The sound of approaching horses interrupted the moment. They emerged from the barn to find Deputy Cole riding into the clearing with 2 other men, all armed but relaxed, clearly not expecting trouble. "Morning," Cole called out. "Came to take those statements I mentioned, and to let you know Vance and his boys are locked up tight. Judge is coming through next month to hear the case. Between your testimony and the physical evidence, they're looking at 10 to 15 years minimum." "Good," Elias said flatly. They spent the next hour recounting the previous night's events in detail. Maeve found it easier than she'd expected to describe what had happened, to explain her decisions and actions without shame or apology. When she told Cole about shooting Vance's hand, the deputy actually nodded approval. Clean shot under pressure, stopped a killing without killing. That takes skill and control most men don't have. He looked between Maeve and Elias. "I'll be honest, when Crow first brought you up here, folks in town figured we'd be finding your body come spring. Thought you were too soft for this life. We were wrong." "Yes," Maeve said simply. "You were." After Cole and his men left, Maeve and Elias returned to the work that had been interrupted by violence. There was still winter to prepare for, still wood to split, and food to preserve. But they worked side by side now with a new understanding, a new closeness that transformed even mundane tasks into something meaningful. Over the next week, life settled into a new rhythm. Storm healed quickly, responding to Elias's veterinary skills and Maeve's constant attention. The chickens laid eggs with satisfying regularity. The weather turned colder but held off on serious snow, giving them precious extra time to finish preparations. And at night, when they climbed to the loft, there was only one bedroll now. Maeve learned the feel of Elias's arms around her, the way he curled his body protectively around hers while they slept. She learned that he talked in his sleep sometimes, muttering about hunting or weather. She learned that he woke before dawn most mornings, and would lie still for a while, just watching her sleep with an expression of quiet wonder. She also learned what it meant to be wanted, not despite her body, but because of it. Elias loved her strength, her size, her capability. He traced the muscles in her arms with admiration, praised the breadth of her shoulders that let her carry heavy loads without strain. In his eyes and hands and words, Maeve finally understood that everything she'd been taught to hate about herself was exactly what made her perfect for this life, for this man, for this love. "You're staring," she said one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting against his shoulder. "Can't help it. Still can't believe you're real." "I'm very real. And very here. And very not going anywhere." "Good." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Because I'd have to track you down and bring you back." "Like you did that first day?" "Exactly like that. Except this time I'd have to grovel and apologize and probably make promises about doing more of the cooking." Maeve laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine joy. "You already do most of the cooking." "Then I'd have to think of other incentives." They talked late into the night about plans for spring, expanding the garden, perhaps getting a few goats, building a second room onto the cabin. The future spread out before them like a trail they'd walk together, challenging and uncertain, but theirs to shape. The first real snow came in mid-November, heavy and sudden, transforming the landscape overnight into something pristine and otherworldly. Maeve woke to find the world outside their window blanketed in white, the mountains rising like frozen giants against a sky so blue it hurt to look at. "Winter's here," Elias said, coming up behind her to wrap his arms around her waist. "We're locked in until spring now, just us and the mountain." "Sounds perfect." And it was. The days grew short and the nights long, but the cabin stayed warm and the food held out and the work continued in its modified winter form. Maeve learned to appreciate the slower pace, the time for reading and talking and simply being together without the pressure of constant preparation. One evening in late December, as wind howled outside and snow piled against the windows, Elias pulled out a small wooden box Maeve had never seen before. "My mother's," he explained, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring. "She died wearing it. I kept it because it was the only thing I had left of her." He held it up to the firelight. "I'd like you to have it. Official-like." Maeve's breath caught. "Elias, I can't. That's your mother's." "Which is exactly why I want you to wear it. You're my family now, my only family, and she would have liked you, would have appreciated your strength." He slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand. Maeve stared at it, this tangible symbol of belonging, of being chosen not as a last resort but as first choice. "There's something I need to give you too," she said, standing up. She climbed to the loft and retrieved her mother's locket from where she kept it wrapped in cloth. Returning, she placed it in Elias's hands. "It's all I have from my mother. The only thing they gave me at the orphanage. I want you to keep it safe." Elias opened the locket carefully. Inside were two tiny portraits, a woman with Maeve's dark hair and strong features, and a man Maeve had never known. "Your parents," he said softly. "I never knew them. But I'd like to think they'd be proud of who I've become, of the life I'm building." "They would be." Elias closed the locket and fastened the chain around Maeve's neck. "But this stays with you, your history, your strength, your survival. You keep it close." She touched the locket, feeling its familiar weight settle against her heart. "Then we both carry our families forward, together." "Together," he agreed. As winter deepened, occasional visitors made their way to the cabin, trappers passing through, a traveling preacher who married them properly in a brief ceremony witnessed by falling snow, traders who brought news from the lowlands. Word had spread about the fight, about Maeve's stand, about the mountain couple who'd defended their home against impossible odds. The stories that came back to them were exaggerated, of course. In some versions, Maeve single-handedly fought off a dozen men. In others, Elias had killed them all with his bare hands. The truth was less dramatic, but more meaningful. Two people who'd found each other, built something together, and proven they'd protect it with everything they had. "They're making us into legends," Maeve said after one trader left, having peppered them with questions about the fight. "Let them. Legends are useful, keeps the genuinely dangerous people away, makes the decent ones respectful." Elias smiled. Besides, there's truth in it. You are legendary, Maeve Crow. Hearing her new name, Crow instead of O'Connor, still gave her a thrill. It marked her transformation completely, from unwanted burden to valued partner, from someone society rejected to someone the mountain accepted absolutely. Spring arrived slowly, the snow melting in patches to reveal brown earth eager for warmth. As the passes cleared and the world beyond the cabin became accessible again, Elias and Maeve made their first trip down to Thornfield together. The town's reception was markedly different from Maeve's arrival months before. People greeted them respectfully, even warmly. The women who'd been chosen before her, Catherine and Sarah and the others, watched with something like envy as Maeve walked through town at Elias's side, clearly valued, clearly loved, clearly exactly where she belonged. Mayor Garrett approached them in the general store, his obsequious smile firmly in place. "Mr. and Mrs. Crow, so good to see you both. I trust you weathered the winter well?" "Well enough," Elias said curtly. "Excellent, excellent. And Mrs. Crow, you're looking quite healthy. Mountain life clearly agrees with you." Maeve met his eyes steadily, remembering the way he'd stood by while she was mocked and humiliated in the square. "It does. Turns out I was exactly suited for it." "Yes, well." Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "I wanted to extend an invitation. The town's having a spring social next month. Dancing, food, community gathering. We'd be honored if you both would attend." Elias looked at Maeve, leaving the decision to her. She considered it, returning to the place of her greatest humiliation, facing all those people who'd laughed at her, proving beyond any doubt how far she'd come and how wrong they'd been. "We'll think about it," she said finally. They finished their shopping and were loading supplies onto Storm when Tucker appeared, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Mrs. Crow," he said, addressing her directly for the first time. "I owe you an apology. The way I acted that day, the things I said, there's no excuse for it. You've proven yourself 10 times over. I was a fool." Maeve studied him, this man who'd rejected her so publicly, who'd called her unfit to be a wife. She could hold on to that anger, nurse it, make him suffer for it. Or she could do what the mountain had taught her, focus on what mattered and let the rest go. "You were a fool," she agreed, "but at least you have the courage to admit it now." Apology accepted. Tucker nodded gratefully and backed away. Elias waited until he was out of earshot before speaking. "You didn't have to forgive him." "I know, but I didn't do it for him. I did it for me." Maeve swung up onto Storm's back with easy grace. "I don't need to carry that anymore. I know what I'm worth now." They rode back to the cabin through awakening forest, passing deer and early wildflowers, and all the signs of renewal that came with spring. When they crested the final rise and the cabin came into view, solid and weathered and undeniably home, Maeve felt her heart swell with something she'd never experienced before in her life. Complete, total, unshakable belonging. Over the following months, they expanded the homestead as planned. The garden flourished under Maeve's care, producing vegetables in quantities that surprised even Elias. They acquired 3 goats that Maeve named and spoiled despite Elias's insistence they were livestock. The chicken flock doubled, and Maeve became adept at collecting eggs and managing the coop. She also continued improving her shooting, her tracking, her survival skills. By midsummer, she could bring down game as cleanly as Elias, could navigate the mountain trails without guidance, could handle any challenge the wilderness threw at her. But more than skills, she'd gained something infinitely more valuable: confidence in her own worth, independent of anyone else's judgment. When they attended Thornfield's Autumn Harvest Festival, Maeve walked into town wearing a dress she'd sewn herself, practical but well-made, fitted to her frame without apology. She wore her mother's locket and her wedding ring and her work-roughened hands with equal pride. The dance was held in the town hall, and Maeve stood at the edge of the floor, watching couples whirl past, remembering the last time she'd been in this town, standing alone while everyone chose someone else. "Dance with me," Elias said, offering his hand. "I don't know how." "Neither do I. We'll figure it out together." He led her onto the floor, and they moved together with none of the grace of the other couples, but all of the certainty. Maeve was aware of people watching, of whispered comments, but for the first time in her life, she didn't care. Let them watch them. Let them whisper. She knew exactly who she was and exactly what she was worth. "You're smiling," Elias observed. I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy. I didn't think that was possible for someone like me. Someone like you deserves happiness more than most. You fought harder for it. As they danced, Maeve caught sight of Catherine, the blonde woman who'd been chosen first that day in the square, who'd looked so triumphant while Maeve stood alone. Catherine was sitting by herself now, her husband nowhere in sight, her expression tired and sad in a way that spoke of disappointments and broken promises. Their eyes met across the dance floor. Catherine's gaze traveled from Maeve's face to her hand clasped in Elias's to the way he held her close, and something like recognition passed between them. Being chosen first hadn't guaranteed happiness. Being pretty hadn't guaranteed value. All the things society promised women would save them had proven hollow. What mattered was finding someone who saw you truly and chose you anyway. What mattered was building something real rather than something pretty. What mattered was partnership forged in work and trust and shared survival. Maeve nodded to Catherine, not in triumph but in understanding, and kept dancing with her husband, her partner, her choice. That night, riding back to the cabin under stars so numerous they seemed to pulse with light, Maeve thought about the journey that had brought her here. The orphanage, the factory, the desperate decision to become a mail-order bride, the humiliation in the square, the terrifying ride up the mountain with a stranger. Any one of those moments could have broken her, could have been the point where she gave up, disappeared, stopped fighting. But instead, each one had been a step toward this, toward home, toward love, toward a life that fit her exactly. "What are you thinking about?" Elias asked. "That day in the square, how much I wanted to disappear. And now? Now I never want to be anywhere else." She looked at him, this man who'd seen value where others saw only deficiency, who'd offered partnership where others offered only pity. "You saved my life that day, Elias. Not from death, but from disappearing while still breathing. You saved mine too. From loneliness. From becoming something less than human because I had no one to be human with." He squeezed her hand. "We saved each other." The cabin appeared ahead, windows dark but welcoming, waiting for them to bring it to life with fire and lamplight and the sounds of living. Storm nickered from the barn, greeting them home. The goats bleated sleepily. Everything was exactly as they'd left it, and exactly as it should be. Inside, Elias built up the fire while Maeve prepared tea, their movements synchronized by months of practice. They settled together on the bench Elias had built, Maeve's head on his shoulder, his arm around her waist, watching flames dance in the hearth. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing me? Taking on all the trouble that came with it?" "Never, not for a single moment." He turned to look at her. "Do you? Regret coming here? Staying?" "Only that I didn't find you sooner, that I wasted so many years believing I was wrong instead of understanding the world was. Then we make up for lost time. We build the life we should have had all along." And they did. Years passed in the steady rhythm of mountain seasons, springs that brought planting and new life, summers of abundance and hard work, autumns of harvest and preparation, winters of closeness and quiet, and the deep satisfaction of survival. They expanded the cabin, adding rooms as their skills and resources grew. They became fixtures in Thornfield's landscape, respected, even admired, the couple who'd defended their home and built something lasting from nothing. Children came eventually, strong and healthy, raised to value capability over appearance, strength over prettiness, character over conformity. Maeve taught them to shoot and plant and survive. Elias taught them to read and think and question. Together they raised children who knew their own worth, independent of the world's judgment. But even as their family grew and the homestead expanded, Maeve never forgot that moment in the square. Never forgot what it felt like to stand alone while the world decided she wasn't worth choosing. She kept the memory sharp, kept it close, because it reminded her of how far she'd come and how much she'd built from that moment of deepest humiliation. On the 10th anniversary of the day Elias had chosen her, they rode down to Thornfield together. The town had changed, grown, become more civilized. But the square was still there, still the heart of the community. Maeve stood in the exact spot where she'd waited all those years ago and felt nothing but gratitude. Gratitude for the mockery that had forced her to leave everything familiar. Gratitude for the fear that had taught her courage. Gratitude for the rejection that had pushed her toward the one acceptance that mattered. "Come on," Elias said, offering his hand. "Let's go home." "Yes," Maeve said, taking his hand, feeling the cool weight of her mother's locket against her heart and her wedding ring solid on her finger. "Let's go home." They rode back to the mountain together, to the cabin they'd built and defended and filled with life and love and laughter, to the place where Maeve O'Connor had become Maeve Crow, where a woman deemed worthless by the world had discovered her own immeasurable value. The sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, and Maeve looked at the life she'd built. Not the life she'd been offered, not the life she'd been told to want, but the life she'd chosen and fought for and created with her own strong hands. And it was perfect, not despite who she was, but because of it. Not in spite of her size and strength and difference, but celebrating them. Not settling for less, but achieving more than she'd ever imagined possible. The woman who'd stood alone in that square, humiliated and hopeless, had become the woman riding home through mountain twilight, loved and valued, and exactly where she belonged. And that transformation, that journey from shame to pride, from rejection to belonging, from disappearing to fully, gloriously existing, was worth every moment of pain it had taken to achieve. The mountain had demanded everything from her, and in return, it had given her everything that mattered. Home, partnership, love, purpose, worth, and the knowledge, bone deep and unshakable, that she was exactly enough, exactly right, exactly who she was always meant to be. The end.